August 28, 1944. 23,000 feet above Namur, Belgium. The high-pitched whine of a P-47 Thunderbolt's turbocharger echoes in the cockpit as Lieutenant James "Sully" Sullivan scans the sky through his oil-smeared canopy. His flight has just finished strafing a rail yard near Liège when his wingman's voice crackles in his headset. "Sully, something just blew past me. I didn't hear it. I felt it." Before Sully can reply, a silver blur cuts across his path like a bullet from the heavens. No propeller, no warning. Just the roar of wind and a strange whistling scream, like a banshee splitting the sky. He jerks the stick hard left. Nothing on his radar, no warning. But there, climbing effortlessly through the contrails, is something utterly alien. Twin jet engines blazing, swept tail, shark-nose cockpit. The Luftwaffe insignia flashes on its fuselage before it vanishes into the sun. Back at base, Sully can barely explain what he saw. It wasn't a rocket. It wasn't a captured P-80. And it was fast, at least 100 miles per hour, faster than anything he'd ever fought. What he had seen was a Messerschmitt Me 262, the first jet-powered fighter ever deployed in combat. The Allies' new jet technology was in development. British and American engineers had both built experimental units. But this? A fully operational jet? Deployed in numbers? It was a shock. For years, experts had insisted that jet engines were impractical, prone to flameout, unstable under acceleration, incapable of handling frontline stress. Some German scientists even agreed. But the Reich, desperate and cornered, had gambled on a revolutionary leap. And now, that gamble was roaring over the skies of Europe. The Me 262 wasn't just a new fighter. It was a paradigm shift. The Allies called an emergency briefing. Photos from reconnaissance over Lechfeld and Augsburg confirmed it. The Germans had gone operational with a jet interceptor, and they were hunting bombers. In London, Eisenhower reviewed the first footage of a Me 262 in flight, jaw tight. The RAF's intelligence chief whispered under his breath, "If they get 500 of these in the air, we'll lose the war in the sky." But there was one piece of good news. The Me 262s were still rare, and they weren't invincible. Not yet. Across airfields in Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were climbing into their strange, sleek new machines. The Schwalbe, they called it, the Swallow. And they were about to change the air war forever. July 25th, 1942. Augsburg, Germany. Engineer Hans Friedrich clasps his hands behind his back, watching his technicians wheel out the strange, sharp-nosed prototype under heavy canvas. Its wings are thin and slightly swept, its undercarriage oddly spindly. There's no roar of a piston engine, just a hollow hush and a promise of something new. They called it Project 1065, but it bore another name now. Messerschmitt Me 262 V3. This wasn't a dream anymore. This was a machine built to shatter limits. Friedrich has worked under Willy Messerschmitt since the late 1930s. He's watched the Reich throw resources at speed and design like it could will itself into supremacy. The Me 262 is supposed to be that supremacy made metal, but he knows what lies beneath that shimmering aluminum skin. Uncertainty. The twin Junkers UMO 004 engines are an engineering marvel and a maintenance nightmare. Each engine can burn out after just 25 hours of flight. The turbines are finicky, vulnerable to heat stress, and devour precious chromium and nickel, metals now nearly impossible to import under Allied blockade. But the Reich pushes forward. Adolf Galland, Luftwaffe ace and general of fighters, flies one of the early test units in April 1943. When he lands, He tears off his flight cap and looks at the ground crew. It felt like I was being pushed by angels. Still, even he knows it's not ready. The engines flame out without warning. Landing gear snaps. And worse, Hitler is meddling. The Führer has taken a personal interest in the Me 262, but in his obsession with vengeance, he demands the aircraft be reconfigured, not as a pure interceptor, but as a Schnell bomber, a fast bomber, to punish London and Antwerp. He imagines squadrons of jets streaking over British cities, dropping explosives and returning before radar can react. The engineers protest. Gallant protests. Even Göring hesitates. But Hitler insists. Precious months are wasted redesigning the nose, installing bomb racks, modifying fuselages for a role the aircraft was never meant to fill. In those same months, the Allies advance through Italy and close in on France. The Me 262 could have flown earlier. It should have flown earlier. But now, it's 1944. And the skies over the Reich are bleeding silver. Massive formations of B-17s and B-24s roar toward Berlin, Munich, Hamburg. The Luftwaffe scrambles to intercept, but its pilots are exhausted, its aircraft outdated. Focke-Wulfs and Bf-109s climb into walls of defensive fire. Casualties mount. Veteran aces are dying faster than they can be replaced. The Reichstag knows it. So does the Führer. And so do the desperate men in Erprobungskommando 262. The test wing tasked with bringing the jet to life. Finally, in July 1944, under growing Allied pressure, the Me 262 enters operational status. A new unit is formed, Jagdgeschwader 7, JG-7, the world's first jet fighter wing. Pilots train at Lechfeld, often with less than 10 hours in the cockpit before combat. They are terrified, not of the enemy, but of the machine. The Jumo engines stall if throttled too quickly. The fuel tanks leak. The takeoff run stretches long, vulnerable to strafing. And landing requires a pilot's full prayer and precision. One mistake and the aircraft breaks apart on the strip. But once in the air, nothing can catch them. They fly at 540 mph, 120 mph faster than a Mustang. They carry four 30mm Mk108 cannons, each one capable of ripping a bomber apart in 2 hits. Their job is clear: break up the American bomber stream, shred the combat box, and survive. That's all that's asked. And it's already almost too much. But even with its flaws, especially with its flaws, the Me 262 is a nightmare the Allies can't ignore. In the West, American strategists debate how to respond. One air intelligence report warns, if the Germans can put 300 jets in the sky at once, daylight bombing must cease immediately. General Karl Spaatz asks for plans to target Me 262 production centers. One name comes up over and over: Augsburg, the cradle of the jet, the beating heart of what could be a new German air superiority. Back in Germany, Hans Friedrich watches another Me 262 being towed onto the runway, the dawn light bouncing off its curved fuselage. A young pilot climbs the ladder slowly, fingers trembling as he pulls on his oxygen mask. Below, ground crews murmur ancient prayers, and as the engines scream to life, the airbase trembles. Not with power, but with fragile hope. October 7th, 1944. Over the skies near Kassel, Germany. The sky is crowded with contrails and chaos. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses stretch from horizon to horizon, flying in tight combat boxes, flanked by clouds of flak and streaks of sunlight. Their destination? The Henschel works near Kassel, a critical target in the German armored supply chain. In one of the lead bombers, Lieutenant John McCarthy, 24, from Brooklyn, grips the controls with practiced calm. This is his 19th mission. He knows the drill. Climb to altitude, hold formation, drop the payload, and pray the Luftwaffe shows up late. But today, something's different. A warning shouts through the intercom. Bandits, fast movers, 9 o'clock high. What happens next is like nothing McCarthy has ever seen. From above and behind, silver-gray streaks descend like falling stars. No engine drone, just a splitting howl. 4 jets slice through the formation at nearly 600 mph. The Me 262s are here. Before the gunners can even swing their 50 cals, the jets are past them, opening up with their quad 30mm cannons. In the span of 8 seconds, 2 bombers erupt, one in a fireball, another tumbling with a wing sheared off. The Me 262s don't stay to dogfight. They punch through the bomber stream like sledgehammers, then disappear into the clouds. A few P-51 Mustangs give chase, but it's like chasing shadows. The jets are gone. Back at base, the surviving bomber crews stumble from their aircraft, dazed. Their debriefing officers are skeptical at first. No propeller? You're saying it sounded like wind tearing paper? But the confirmation comes from multiple gun camera films and wreckage. This wasn't a one-time fluke. Germany's jets are active. Over the following weeks, Me-262s begin appearing more frequently, targeting Allied bomber groups over Cologne, Frankfurt, and Berlin. Their tactics are simple but terrifyingly effective. Approach from above and behind, unleash a devastating salvo, and retreat before escort fighters can intercept. Pilots call them blitz ghosts. For the Luftwaffe, it's a flicker of hope. Morale has collapsed across most fighter squadrons. The once glorious Jagdwaffe is reduced to poorly trained boys in worn-out Bf-109s. Fuel is scarce. Airfields are bombed daily. The sky belongs to the Allies, but the Me-262 changes the tone, if not the outcome. Oberleutnant Georg Peter Eder scores 12 kills in 1 month flying the jet. Heinz Baer, a veteran ace, claims over a dozen bombers and 262s before war's end. And Adolf Galland, demoted and disgraced for opposing Hitler's bomber plan, is recalled to form an elite jet unit, JV-44. Galland chooses only the best, former aces and survivors of the Eastern and Western fronts. They fly from makeshift runways under constant threat of air raids, often with barely enough fuel for a sortie and return. And still, they go. But the jet's edge is constantly dulled by reality. Each Me-262 takes over 6,000 man-hours to produce. Materials are rare. Allied bombing raids on Augsburg and Regensburg cripple supply chains. Hitler's obsession with the Blitz bomber version delays full-scale fighter deployment by nearly a year. And perhaps worst of all, the jets need long, flat runways to take off. American and British tactical commanders realize this and act quickly. Fighter bombers begin patrolling near Me-262 bases, waiting for takeoff or landing windows, the aircraft's most vulnerable moments. Mustangs, Tempests, and Thunderbolts lurk like wolves, strafing runways the moment jets appear. Veteran jet pilots begin requesting flak protection just to get airborne. Some bases resort to launching Me-262s under cover of anti-aircraft fire. Others build short concrete ramps to help shorten takeoff runs. Still, losses mount. Even when the jets do get airborne, the numbers aren't enough. JG-7 never fields more than 80 serviceable Me-262s at once. Fuel shortages force many aircraft to sit idle. Many new pilots, barely trained, die on their first sortie. Engines explode, tires burst, and the Luftwaffe's once-feared coordination is gone. Yet for every bomber downed, the message gets louder. Jet power has arrived. In the Allied camp, engineers and strategists double down. The British Gloucester Meteor is rushed into home defense, chasing V-1 rockets. The Americans fast-track jet engine designs and scramble to collect every fragment of crashed Me-262s they can recover. But they all know this German marvel, elegant and brutal, has come too late to change the tide. Still, in the minds of every crewman who saw one flash past, in the shaking hands of every tail gunner who heard that banshee scream, the Me-262 leaves a mark. It is no longer theory. It is no longer a rumor. It is war, rewritten at 540 miles per hour. November 1944. Berlin, Führerbunker. The air is stale with cigarette smoke and sweat. Maps of the Western Front lie scattered across the table, dotted with red pushpins and black arrows. Adolf Hitler leans in, trembling hand tapping a report marked Me-262 deployment. He doesn't speak at first, just stares. Then, in a sharp bark of frustration, he slams his fist down. It must be a bomber. It must strike London. That is the only way to break them. Around him, generals flinch. Albert Speer says nothing. Goering looks down. No one dares correct the Führer now, not directly. But beneath the surface, resistance stirs. One man has already begun to rebel in quiet. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland. Stripped of his post earlier that year for questioning Hitler's obsession with revenge bombing, Galland is no stranger to confrontation. He knows what the Me-262 is. Not a bomber, not a toy, but the only hope of holding the line against the incoming tide of Allied steel. He's seen the reports. 30 Me-262s intercept a bomber formation. 17 B-17s fall. The attack lasts 5 minutes. That's not a bombing run. That's control of the air. But still, Hitler insists. He sees the Me-262 not as a fighter, but a Vergeltungswaffe, a weapon of vengeance. Galland, like many Luftwaffe commanders, is disgusted. He writes in his private notes, "We are throwing pearls before swine, a miracle weapon wasted." Then, finally, a break. In January 1945, with the Reich crumbling, Hitler allows Galland to form a specialized jet fighter squadron. It is not forgiveness. It is desperation. Galland calls it Jagdverband 44, JV-44. He selects only seasoned pilots, men who have flown against Spitfires, Mustangs, Yaks, and Lightnings. No training wheels, no politics, just survival and skill. Their base is set at München-Riem. Their Me-262s are painted blood red on the underside to signal friendly forces not to shoot them down during takeoff. Their mascot is a laughing skeleton riding a rocket, cigar in its teeth. Galland himself flies combat missions, something no senior Luftwaffe officer had done in years. But the squadron faces challenges from the first day. Each sortie requires perfect timing, from fueling to engine warm-up to anti-aircraft protection during the long taxi run. Allied fighter bombers now roam freely over Germany's skies, striking anything that moves on a runway. Many Me-262s are lost before ever leaving the ground. So Galland creates a radical solution. He assigns a protection unit of piston engine fighters, FW-190 Doras, whose only job is to fly cover as the jets take off and land. They are jokingly dubbed the Würgerstaffel, the Butcher Bird Squadron. It's an odd sight. The most advanced aircraft in the world, protected by aging piston fighters on patched-up tires. It speaks volumes about the condition of Germany's Air Force by 1945, ingenuity fighting decay. Despite this, JV-44 performs. Their kill ratios are extraordinary. In April alone, they claim over 50 Allied aircraft, including Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and even a few daring Mosquitoes. Galland himself scores several victories in quick, savage bursts of cannon fire. But it is not enough. No matter how fast the Me-262 flies, it cannot be everywhere. The Allied onslaught is total, from sea, from land, from air. Germany is shrinking by the hour. Fuel runs dry. Spare parts vanish. Engines flame out mid-mission. Ground crews, once composed of trained specialists, are now teenagers and old men. Galland watches it all with grim clarity. He knows what they've built. He knows what it could have been, if only deployed a year earlier. If only as a fighter from the start. If only the Reich had listened to its pilots instead of chasing fantasy. By March 1945, even JV-44 is barely operational. The red-bellied jets grow fewer and fewer. Munich burns in the distance, and Galland, sitting beside his aircraft, lights a cigarette and watches the sky as American P-51s wheel lazily overhead, unchallenged. In the hangars nearby, grounded Me-262s sit half-stripped, their engines scavenged, their canopies fogged with dust. Ghosts of a future that arrived too late. March 10, 1945. RAF High Wycombe, England. Inside a smoke-filled operations room, under the muted glow of green desk lamps, a group of American and British officers gather around a projection board. Intelligence photographs line the walls, some blurry, others shockingly clear. All show the same thing. Sleek, twin-engine aircraft with no propellers, parked in tight clusters on concrete airstrips deep inside Germany. One photo shows the Lechfeld airfield, another, Lager Lechfeld, another, Schwechat near Vienna. The verdict is unanimous. The Me-262 is real. It is operational, and it is a threat that cannot be allowed to mature. Colonel Elliot Roosevelt, FDR's son and commander of a reconnaissance wing, says it plainly. This bird gives them a fighting chance. That's too much already. By now, Me-262s have downed over 200 Allied bombers and escorts. Not enough to turn the war, but more than enough to scare planners in London and Washington. The fear isn't what the jet is today. It's what it could become tomorrow. If Germany can scale production, if the Soviets are watching and copying, if the post-war world inherits the sky from these machines, the Allies have a window, a closing one. Within days, Allied planners shift priorities. New directives are issued to bomber crews and fighter groups across the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command. Target all known Me-262 facilities. Destroy runways, fuel depots, engine plants, and rail lines supplying them. Priority: maximum. On March 18th, more than 1,300 American bombers, escorted by 700 fighters, launch a coordinated raid against the Me-262 airfields near Berlin. It is one of the largest single-day air operations in the war's history. At Brandenburg-Brest, over 20 Me-262s are destroyed on the ground. At Lechfeld, strafing runs from P-47s catch several jets during takeoff. Pilots never even lift the nose wheel before their aircraft disintegrates under fire. And at Neuburg, RAF Mosquitoes drop delayed action bombs, rendering the runways unusable for days. But even with the jets under siege, the threat isn't gone, because the Me-262 still flies, and when it does, it kills. Over the Ruhr, a formation of B-24 Liberators is ambushed by a mixed group of Me-262s and FW-190s. The escorting P-51 Mustangs can't close the gap fast enough. 3 bombers vanish in flashes of fire. Another limps home on one engine, 11 holes punch through the fuselage. On the ground, American fighter groups begin adopting new tactics. The 339th Fighter Group, under Lieutenant Quarters John B. Henry, establishes rhubarb patrols, loitering just outside Me-262 bases, waiting for jets to begin their vulnerable takeoff runs. Others adopt a bounce-and-strike method. High-altitude loiter, then fast descent to catch returning jets low and slow. Mustang pilot Chuck Yeager would later describe the Me-262 as Fast, smooth, and hard to catch, unless you were already behind it on landing. Several successful kills come not in air combat, but from coordinated ambushes near runways. One of the most daring attacks occurs in April 1945, when Captain Edward Hayden and his wingman dive from 10,000 feet onto a pair of jets taxiing near Augsburg. They destroy both with 50 caliber bursts, pulling out barely 50 feet above the ground, chased by flak all the way out. But there's a growing realization among Allied flyers. They don't fear the Me 262 because of what it is. They fear it because of what it proves. This isn't science fiction anymore. Jet warfare has arrived. And when the war ends, whatever's left of this terrifying machine will be studied, dissected, and copied. Because in every Mustang pilot who saw one disappear into the clouds, there was the same thought. That's the future. And next time, it might not be German. Back in Lechfeld, under camouflage netting torn by wind and artillery fire, Luftwaffe mechanics salvage what they can. A broken jet is rolled into a hangar, its nose shattered, engines melted. There are no spare parts, no more fuel trucks. The field smells of spilled kerosene and failure. The war is in its final weeks, but the Me 262 still flies. Not to win, not anymore, but to remind. It is the last breath of a dying Reich, and the first scream of a new era. April 29th, 1945. Lagerlechfeld Air Base, Bavaria. Rain taps quietly on the twisted wreckage of what was once a runway. The Luftwaffe ground crews have fled. Empty fuel drums roll in the wind like tumbleweeds, bumping against the charred husks of Me 262s burned where they stood. In a darkened hangar, an American patrol moves cautiously through the wreckage. Rifles raised, breath steaming in the cold morning air. Captain Richard Becker, 35th Infantry Division, pushes aside a fallen steel beam and freezes. Before him stands a battered but intact Messerschmitt Me 262. Its wings are scorched, one engine still warm from recent use. The cockpit canopy is open. A map flutters in the wind on the pilot's seat. Someone left in a hurry. Becker doesn't recognize the aircraft by name, but he knows what it is. They've been hunting it for weeks. All across southern Germany, Allied units are racing not just to defeat the Wehrmacht, but to capture it, to get to the rocket labs, the jet plants, the secret bunkers before the Soviets do. The Me 262 is at the top of every list. At Lagerlechfeld, they hit the jackpot. Within 24 hours, engineers and intelligence officers swarm the airfield. What they find is astonishing. Crates of spare engines, test records, factory blueprints, fuel formulas, even a partially disassembled jet trainer variant, a two-seat Me 262B. A few days later, at Lechfeld, the U.S. 54th Air Disarmament Squadron seizes multiple intact Me 262s and pilots to fly them. Some of those Luftwaffe men, starving and defeated, agree to cooperate in exchange for safety. One pilot, Klaus Neumann, stares down at the P-51 Mustangs parked alongside his former base and mutters, "We thought we were flying the future. Now I suppose it belongs to you." Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army Air Forces act quickly. Under Operation Lusty, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, dozens of Me 262s are shipped back to the United States. Some are flown directly out of Germany by former Luftwaffe pilots under Allied supervision. Others are dismantled, crated, and loaded onto C-54 Skymasters bound for Wright Field in Ohio. There, American test pilots like Chuck Yeager and Colonel Watson, nicknamed Watson's Whizzers, take the Me 262 into the air again, this time with U.S. markings on the fuselage. What they find confirms their fears and their respect. The Me 262 is fast. It accelerates like nothing they've flown. Its roll rate is sluggish, and its engine's temperamental, but its raw speed is unmatched. In level flight, it outpaces anything in the American inventory. In the right hands, it would have been a devastating weapon, if Germany had built it earlier, in numbers, and protected it properly. But for all its speed, the jet couldn't outrun the truth. The Me 262 arrived too late to save a dying regime. By May 8th, Me-45, V-Day. Most surviving Me-262s are grounded, out of fuel, or abandoned. Some are found nose down in forest clearings, hastily buried by retreating crews. Others are left in barns, hidden from both Allies and Soviets in a last act of defiance. A handful make it to Czechoslovakia, where post-war engineers keep them flying for years under the name Aviation S-92. But the era of the German jet is over. Its legacy, however, is just beginning. In America, the swept-wing research that had stalled during the war is suddenly back in motion. Bell Aircraft and Lockheed engineers pore over the Me-262's airframe. By 1947, the Bell X-1, the rocket plane that would break the sound barrier, borrows heavily from the lessons learned. In the Soviet Union, captured Me-262s are reverse-engineered and studied by top designers, including Artem Mikoyan. Their influence echoes in early MiG jet fighters, and in every hangar where it was tested, in every wind tunnel where its lines were copied. The Me-262 left fingerprints on the future of war, on the nature of air superiority, on the balance between engineering ambition and political failure. It wasn't just the first jet. It was the start of something no one could put back in the box. In one final, bitter irony, the jet Germany hoped would turn the tide became a blueprint for the very powers that defeated it. April 1945. Near Munich, Oberfähnrich Karl-Heinz Becker squints into the morning haze as he walks across the cratered tarmac. He's 19. The Me-262 in front of him glistens with dew, its silver skin scarred by soot and shrapnel. The ground crew is gone. Most of them were teenagers, just like him. Some dead, some fled. Some vanished into the forest, uniforms traded for civilian coats. He climbs the ladder and lowers himself into the cockpit. It's silent. No chatter from the tower. No briefing. Just the distant thunder of artillery. The Americans are maybe 30 miles away. Carl doesn't have a mission order. He has fuel, barely. And he has fear, plenty. He flicks the battery switch. The engines begin their long, whistling whine, turbines spinning up slow like some ancient beast waking from a cold sleep. It takes almost a full minute to spool. He can feel the weight of it, both physical and historical. This is not a fighter like the Bf-109. This thing doesn't fly with instinct. It demands discipline. Carl's instructor had told him, "You don't fly a jet, you manage it." That was lesson 1. Lesson 2? Don't touch the throttle too fast unless you want to turn into fireworks. Most new pilots transitioning from piston aircraft struggled with the Me-262. It was fast, sometimes too fast. The twin Jumo 04 engines responded sluggishly. Throttle up too quickly and you could cause a compressor stall. Throttle down too fast and you'd flame out mid-air. And unlike a Mustang or a Thunderbolt, there was no torque to help you turn. No tight radius dogfighting. If you wanted to live in a Me-262, you climbed high, picked your shots, and never turned around. It was a sniper rifle at 600 miles an hour. Veterans adapted quickly. Pilots like Heinrich Baer, Walter Nowotny, and Georg Peter Eder knew the limits and exploited them. They dove from altitude, pulled the trigger once, and vanished. No dogfight, no second chances. But the young ones? The ones like Carl? They were fed into it too fast. By early 1945, training programs were a skeleton of what they once were. Many new jet pilots logged fewer than 5 flight hours in piston aircraft before moving to the Me 262. Some barely completed a single jet landing before they were sent into combat. The result was predictable and tragic. More Me 262s were lost to takeoff and landing accidents than to enemy fire. On final approach, the jet slowed like a brick. Pilots unfamiliar with managing engine delay often came in too low, flared too late, or pancaked nose first into the runway. If they survived the crash, they often didn't survive the strafing runs that followed. American and British pilots knew the drill. Find a Me 262 airfield. Wait for takeoff or landing. Strike when they were slowest and most exposed. Despite this, many pilots still volunteered to fly the 262. Some out of pride, some out of desperation, and some, like Gallen's JV-44 men, because it was the only machine left that offered a fighting chance. Inside the cockpit, the Me 262 was surprisingly simple. Analog dials, minimal instrumentation. The pilot sat far forward, the control stick short and stiff. But visibility was excellent. And once airborne, the aircraft was smooth, like skating on air. The armament was devastating. 4 30mm Mk108 cannons, mounted in the nose, could tear through a B-17 in seconds. Each shell was the size of a small flashlight. 2 hits on target and a bomber disintegrated. And then there were the rockets. In the spring of 1945, some Me 262s were equipped with R-4M Orkan air-to-air rockets, 55 mm unguided missiles mounted under the wings. Fired in salvos at tight bomber formations, they could punch holes through entire squadrons. In one instance, a single Me 262 destroyed 3 B-17s in a single pass with a ripple of R-4Ms. But even with those weapons, the Me 262 couldn't stop the bleeding. For every bomber shot down, a dozen more made it through. For every ace who survived a mission, 2 rookies didn't come back. Fuel shortages, collapsing infrastructure, and overwhelming Allied numbers made even successful sorties feel hollow. And yet, men like Carl kept flying. That morning, he lifts off alone from a fractured runway, the aircraft yawing slightly as he clears the tree line. There are no wingmen, no ground control. Just the sky, gray and endless, and the radio crackling static. He doesn't know where the enemy is. He doesn't know if he'll make it back. But he's airborne. And for 22 minutes that morning, the last generation of German fighter pilots still flies, not for victory, not even for survival, but because it's all they have left. January 1943. Messerschmitt Headquarters, Augsburg. A quiet argument brews behind closed doors. Engineers, test pilots, and Luftwaffe officers crowd around a polished wooden table. On it lies a set of blueprints for the Me 262. Its frame is ready, the airframe tested. The engines, though temperamental, have now flown several times without catastrophic failure. Sitting stiffly across from the room, Major General Adolf Galland speaks bluntly. This is the aircraft that will keep us in the war. Get it into the air as a fighter. Now. There is a long pause. Then the representative from the Führer's staff speaks up. A man from the Chancellery. Not a pilot. Not an engineer. The Führer is of the opinion it should carry bombs. We require it as a fast bomber to strike England. That single sentence dooms months, maybe years, of German air superiority. The delay is catastrophic. Instead of ramping up immediate production of the jet fighter, Messerschmitt is forced to redesign the nose, modify the bomb racks, and shift the center of gravity to accommodate a mission profile it was never meant to fulfill. By the time the Me-262 enters service in meaningful numbers, nearly a year has passed. A year of Allied advances. A year of bombing raids. A year where P-51 Mustangs start escorting bombers deep into the Reich and begin slaughtering Germany's exhausted fighter corps. In that time, some 18,000 Luftwaffe pilots are killed. Replacement rates collapse. Fuel shortages cripple training. Germany's once feared air defense is reduced to scattered, desperate sorties flown by undertrained teenagers in aircraft held together with spare parts and hope. And when the Me-262 finally does arrive, it is spectacular, revolutionary, but no longer decisive. Had it arrived in late 1943, when Germany still had trained pilots, secure airfields, and semi-intact supply lines, the story might have been different. But history does not bend to possibilities. Galland later wrote, "We had the ultimate weapon, but it was locked in a box, and the key was thrown away. That box was bureaucracy. The key, lost in Hitler's obsession with vengeance. The Luftwaffe wasn't just fighting the Allies. It was fighting its own leadership. Fighter generals were overruled. Engineers were muzzled. Decisions came from bunkers, not battlefields. Take the production of the Jumo 04 engine, the centerpiece of the Me-262. It required rare metals that Germany could no longer reliably source. Engineers had to replace heat-resistant alloys with cheaper alternatives, reducing engine lifespan from 150 flight hours to just 25, sometimes less. Yet instead of reducing sortie expectations, the high command demanded more. Pilots knew the risks. A mid-air flameout at 30,000 feet left you a glider, hoping for a long runway. If both engines died, your only option was to punch out. If your Me-262 even had an ejector seat, which most didn't, and those who survived such crashes often limped back to ruined bases with nothing left to fly. Meanwhile, the Allied bombing campaign only intensified. Precision raids targeted Me-262 production facilities at Regensburg, Neuburg, and Obertraubling. The Schweinfurt ball bearing plant, critical to aircraft manufacturing, was hit repeatedly. It wasn't just about shooting down jets. It was about suffocating the ecosystem that fed them. And it worked. By late March 1945, Hitler's headquarters was receiving reports that fewer than 100 Me-262s were operational across all of Germany. Many lacked fuel. Others couldn't take off due to cratered runways. Some were cannibalized to keep others flying. The Reich's best chance had been squandered. The technology had matured, but the war around it had moved too far, too fast. Even the idea of jet warfare, once so futuristic, had now passed into the hands of the Allies. American teams were already in Europe, photographing, measuring, and disassembling every Me-262 they could get their hands on. The jet that could have defended the skies of Germany now sat as a museum piece, a trophy of what could have been. For the men who built it, there was no pride, only silence. They knew what they had created, and they knew what had been wasted. By the time the last Me-262s were scrambled in late April, many of their own pilots questioned the point. They flew because orders told them to. They flew because there was nothing else left to do. But they flew too late. And when they disappeared into the clouds, they left behind the echo of a war Germany had already lost. April 21st, 1945. Pocking Airfield, Lower Bavaria. The sound of engines has faded. The once bustling hangars are eerily silent. Discarded tools lie in the mud beside scorched concrete. Barracks stand empty, their doors swinging loose in the spring wind. Above, The sky is bruised and overcast, thick with the smell of smoke from distant fires. Inside a half-collapsed control tower, Lieutenant Erich Rudorfer scans a map under a flickering lantern. He's flown over 200 missions, scored more than 200 kills. But today, none of that matters. What's left of his unit, JV-44, has 2 serviceable Me-216s. There's barely enough fuel for one more sortie. Outside, the last operational jet sits waiting, its port engine covered in soot, the air intake dented by shrapnel. The maintenance crew is gone. The flak batteries stripped. The base defenses? A few conscripts with rifles and a lone 20mm cannon mounted on a pickup truck. Still, Rudorfer straps in. Why? He doesn't quite know. Maybe it's duty. Maybe it's the need to go down flying, not hiding. Maybe it's just habit. He taxis slowly over broken ground, weaving around craters as artillery echoes from the west. The Americans are only 10 kilometers away. He doesn't expect to return, and he's not alone. Across southern Germany in the war's final days, Me-262 pilots launch scattered, almost symbolic missions. No strategy, no coordination, just scattered jets clawing into the sky like ghosts from another war. Some hit Allied convoys. Others strafe temporary bridges across the Danube. One pilot reportedly shot down a lone reconnaissance P-38 before vanishing into cloud cover, never to be seen again. But mostly, they burn fuel and vanish. Many don't survive. Not because of enemy fire, but because of accidents, bad landings, or simply having nowhere to return to. By late April, most Me-262 airstrips are unusable. Runways are bombed out, littered with debris or overrun. Some pilots attempt landings in fields, forests, or highways. Some succeed. Many don't. At Munich-Rhein, the final red-bellied JV-44 fighters are ordered to destroy their own aircraft before American armor rolls in. Pilots pour fuel over the wings, light fuses, and step back in silence. One man watches his jet burn with tears in his eyes. Another simply walks away without a word. Meanwhile, the Allies arrive. At airfields across Bavaria, American GIs encounter the Me-262 face-to-face for the first time. Not in combat, but as relics of a war already ending. They find sleek fuselages resting half-hidden under camouflage netting. They find hangars filled with crates of spare parts, untouched aircraft, and scattered blueprints. Some GIs pose for photographs beside the jet. Others poke at the strange twin engines, run their hands over the aluminum skin, and marvel aloud. Hell of a thing, huh? Good thing it came too late. But a few are uneasy. They know this isn't the end. It's the beginning of something new. As American engineers document and dismantle the jets, a darker truth sets in. The Me-262 didn't lose because it was flawed. It lost because its country was broken, its leadership deluded, its factories overrun, its pilots outnumbered, its timing fatally late. But the machine itself? It was years ahead of its time. It hinted at what was coming. Faster, higher, deadlier wars. Wars fought at supersonic speeds, where the sky would belong not to the boldest, but to the fastest. And for a brief moment in 1945, that sky was broken open by German jets with iron crosses on their tails. Even in failure, they had changed the rules. Back in Pocking, Rudorfer lands on a stretch of highway just as his fuel sputters dry. He shuts down the engine and climbs out. There's no one to meet him. Just the wind and the sound of an American column approaching from the trees. He removes his gloves, sets them on the wing, and walks toward the sound of boots. For him, for the Me-262, the war is over. But the jet age has already begun. May 1945, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, under heavy guard and covered in tarps. The captured Messerschmitt Me 260s arrive one by one, shipped in crates across the Atlantic, reassembled by American technicians, and rolled onto the test flight line under gray Midwestern skies. The war in Europe is over, but the race to understand what made these machines possible is just beginning. The aircraft look like they don't belong, like they were built 20 years too early. Sleek lines, no propeller, a fighter that barely makes a sound until it screams past. One mechanic whispers, "Looks like something from a Buck Rogers comic." Test pilot Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hal Watson is the first to climb into one. He's flown everything, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings. But as he settles into the cockpit of the ME 262, he feels something different. This isn't a hot rod. It's a weapon built for speed and kill ratios. No dogfighting, no flare, just a high-speed ambush tool. The first flight is short, just enough to feel it out. The climb is slow, the controls stiff, but once level, the aircraft stretches out and moves like glass on ice. Watson pushes it past 500 mph. There's no rattle, no shudder, just an eerie smoothness. He returns to base, parks the jet, and takes a long breath before stepping down. It's unstable, it's twitchy. But if we'd fought these in numbers a year earlier, we'd be telling a different story. Behind him, engineers swarm the plane. They photograph every angle, strip the skin back, measure the airfoils, and examine the Jumo 004 engines like archaeologists sifting through ruins. There's a sense among the team that they're not just learning, they're inheriting. Across the country, other teams do the same. In California, Lockheed studies the Me 262 to inform the P-80 Shooting Star. Northrop draws on its swept wing designs for its YB-49 flying wing. In Langley, wind tunnel data from Me 262 replicas confirmed theories about high-speed drag and compressibility that were previously only understood on paper. In the Soviet Union, it's no different. Captured Me 262s are tested at Zhukovsky Airfield. Soviet engineers examine the engines and reverse engineer their structure. Within 5 years, the MiG-9 and later MiG-15 incorporate many of the same ideas. Underslung engine nacelles, swept wings, streamlined fuselage for transonic flight. Germany's failure became everyone else's foundation. And what of the men who built it? Willy Messerschmitt, the jet's creator, is imprisoned after the war. He is eventually released, and by the 1950s is designing civilian aircraft. He never again reaches the heights or the ambition of the Me 262 project. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe general who championed the jet as a fighter from the beginning, survives. He is interrogated, respected by his captors, and eventually moves to Argentina to advise their air force. He remains proud of the aircraft, but never shy about condemning the delays that sabotaged its impact. In post-war Germany, remnants of the Me 262 are scattered. Burned-out wrecks in forests, stripped airframes in barns, buried engine blocks in shallow graves of concrete and clay. But in a few museums, fully restored 262s now stand, some airworthy, some silent. Their presence draws veterans and pilots from both sides. They come not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. Because for all its flaws, the Me 262 was a warning. It showed what happens when technology outpaces strategy, when engineering brilliance is chained to delusion, and when a machine meant to protect a nation becomes the symbol of its last breath. In the end, the Me 262 didn't change the war. It changed the future. It forced the world to think faster, Build faster, fly faster. It ushered in an age where jet engines would carry man across continents and eventually beyond the atmosphere. But back in the spring of 1945, above the ruins of a shattered Reich, it was simply a machine trying to survive. For those who flew it, it offered a glimpse of what might have been. For those who fought against it, it left a memory of something terrifying, unreal, and too fast to follow. And for history, it remains frozen at the edge of a fading contrail, an echo of speed, fire, and missed redemption.